Rigour Flow.
Yeah.
We have a name for our show, and the name for our show is Rigour and Flow with
myself, Aiwan,
and myself, Tamanda. This is the show where business meets love
and culture meets critique.
We actually have a tagline.
Isn't
that mad?
It took a long time. We only got the tagline a couple of weeks before this recording. We're recording in February.
I have a question for you. Is it possible to be Christian, to be gay, and to be African? And I mean specifically Black African.
So in a nutshell, yes, of course. In a nut tree, it's complicated. Very, very complicated.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
So I think the physicality of being, lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender is just a thing that happens in nature to human beings. And so anybody, anywhere can be lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender, right? It doesn't matter what ethnicity you are or anything like that, or what faith, because nature doesn't pay respects to those things. It just dishes out what it dishes out, right? However, when it comes to the social, societal, familial aspects of that reality, that's a whole different situation.
100%. I totally couldn't agree more. I mean, in the last few days, in fact, at the point we're recording this, we've just seen this massively high-profile case of what the newspapers are dubbing the world's first vocally out gay imam in South Africa, who's been murdered. We don't know exactly what the circumstances are yet, but you just need to look down one comment thread under some of the reporting to realize there's people out there who see this as extremely controversial and who say, no, it's not possible to be all of these things, like religious, in this case Muslim, and gay, and African. He is African, although a different ethnicity, not necessarily Black African. So yeah, that's why I really, really at this particular moment want your take on what it has been to have those identities for you and what's complicated about it.
Yeah, that case for me fills me with so much sadness. Obviously, we don't know whether it was a homophobic attack. But even just the loss of a figure like that within the religious community, advocating for the inclusion of LGBTQ plus Muslims is a huge loss.
Yeah. I guess one of the reasons I really want to hear your take on this is because one of the first bits of content that I ever watched of yours, actually long before I knew you, was your film, Kenyan Christian Queer. And the way I came to discover that film was that a mentor of mine, Aiwan Tamanda, who's a professor in the department I did my PhD in, he was promoting it. And I watched it because I saw the trailer. This powerful, powerful prophetess woman, a gay African woman, talking about that, you could come as you are and you'd be accepted by the church in Africa, not in the West, not here in the diaspora. And it was it kind of blew my mind. So yeah, tell, for people who are listening, what was the film about and how did it come about?
So Kenyan Christian Queer, as you mentioned, Professor Aiwan Tamanda wrote a book of the same name. And fun fact, it's actually my hands that are on the cover of the book.
Yeah. I have to say, little anecdote, again, before we met, when he did his book launch and I saw the hands and the cover on this screen in, I think it was a chapel he launched the book in, our university chapel, I remember just being captivated by the hands on the cover. I just really looked at them. I should also say, for the tea, I was a married woman at the time. I'm not saying I was sexually attracted to the hand. I don't have a hand fetish, but I was captivated. I'm not going to lie. So to discover that those are now the hands of my wife, that's a whole nother story for another day. But it is interesting.
That's for our OnlyFans.
Anyway, I digress. We digress. Tell me, you met Adrian, who had a book of the same name.
Yeah, so I met Adrian. We'd been friends for a few years at that point, and he was talking to me about the book. And I remember when he was telling me some of the potential titles, I was like, obviously I'm from the entertainment industry. We love,
salacious
sex, popping, snappy,
drugs,
punchy, all of that good stuff.
Rock and roll,
all of that stuff, right?
Yeah.
So I said to him, my guy, you've got to sex up the title. Even if you want to do those typical long-winded subtitles that you academics like to do, the actual main title needs to be punchy, sexy, all of that good stuff.
Attention grabbing.
And so I think he came up with the title, and I loved it. The alliteration was brilliant. And he gave me a copy of the manuscript of the book. And so I remember reading it. And I remember I was thinking to myself, I thought I was going to be reading a very academic text.
Yeah.
And actually what I ended up reading was a very intimate, personal story. So he actually talks about his story as a gay man. For those who don't know, Adrian is a white Dutch gay man. And he actually talks about how he contracted HIV whilst in Africa.
Yeah.
And I remember just thinking to myself, this is not like any other academic book. And there were so many beautiful stories in there. And the one that really grabbed me was the story of the first LGBTQ plus church in Nairobi, which is the capital of Kenya. And it was a church called the Cosmopolitan Affirming Church, or the Cosmopolitan Affirming Ministry.
We should say it's 5 years since
it's been
you did
5
this
years.
film.
It's actually 5 years this year since that film came out. We were shooting it 2 years prior.
Yeah.
And it came out, 1 year prior.
Yeah.
And then it came out in 2020.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like I have lots to say because I too was profoundly changed by reading Adrian's book, which was a really vulnerable, at times, frankly, very uncomfortable book to read.
Yes.
That's something we should talk about another time. I think it would be great to have Adrian come in at some point.
Yeah, so he can tell his side of things. Absolutely.
It would be really good to do that. What I was curious about as well in that story is why did you decide to hone in on that particular story, and how did it feel arriving in Kenya and seeing this church firsthand, which must have been quite different from what you had been accustomed to, I guess?
Yeah, I think, so my background, I grew up in I would just say a fundamentalist Pentecostal community.
Yeah.
The reason why I use the term fundamentalist is because the beliefs were very, very strong, unapologetic, unrelenting, and unquestionable. So, and it governed everything from what you wore, what you celebrated or didn't celebrate, where you were allowed to go or not go, who you interacted with and who you didn't interact with, what food you ate, etc., etc. It governs all the aspects of yourself. And in some ways you could say that that church was very similar to a cult, So it's very, it's a very stringent form of Christianity. And so when I went to Kenya, there were two things that hit me first. First, I'm from West Africa, Nigeria. I've never been to East Africa. In fact, at that point, I had never been to any other part of Africa other than West Africa, as far as I'm aware. And so it was my first time being in East Africa.
Okay.
And second of all, it was my first time being in a queer LGBTQ plus church that was also Pentecostal.
Yeah, wow.
Because I had been in other affirming churches. So when we say affirming, we're talking about churches that are inclusive
Of LGBTQ
plus people.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. the difference between those churches that I had been in after coming out and leaving the church that I was in is that those churches tended to either be, I was in the Quakers at one point.
Me too, side note. I had a little
very
stint
silent.
with the Quakers, very silent and very full
silent.
of older white men.
Yeah.
We can talk about another episode, another time.
Episode of the Quakers with Rigour Flow. But so there was the Quakers, so very still, very quiet, very white, very middle class. It felt like, at least the one that I was in at the time. Mm-hmm. And then I had been to a couple of the other more well-known affirming churches that they felt very Anglican. In their
not
services.
Methodist or
no, they were Anglican.
Okay,
yeah.
okay.
So the order of service, you had your piece of paper that told you exactly what was going to happen, what hymns were going to be sung. It was very traditional in that very English traditional way.
Yeah.
The songs were very traditional. It all happened in a very ordered way.
Yeah.
And the service lasted a very short amount of time. Now, if you juxtapose that with my Pentecostal.
I was going to say, are you trying to say it was stiff and boring and stayed?
Let's just say that it was not something I was used to or accustomed to because, my background in the Pentecostal church, it was a fire and brimstone church. The services can go on for as long as the pastor feels like, frankly. So, a service can go 1 hour if he's not in the mood, or it could go 4 hours, or it could go the whole day.
Yikes.
And you sit there and you worship.
You will worship.
You will worship, and you will listen to the sermons and listen to the songs.
You'll listen to the word of God.
You'll listen to the word of God.
Yeah.
So, I'm coming from that space, and the music is very much, African music. The rhythms are African, the melodies are African, the song lyrics are often in Pidgin English or whatever other, like some of the songs would be in Igbo, for example, which is a tribe from Nigeria, or they'd be in Yoruba, and so on and so forth. So it was very much rooted not just in that Pentecostal tradition, but also in the Nigerian culture. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then at the end of the service, you're eating jollof rice and meat pie and, drinking super malt and stuff like that. That wasn't happening in these churches. And then I think the other church that I attended, which I loved, was Reverend Jide's House of Rainbow. That's actually the church that helped me find my way, if I'm being honest. And I will always forever hold Reverend Jide in high regard because he really helped me to navigate my queerness and coming out and trying to reconcile my faith and my sexuality. But I think the thing I found with House of Rainbow for me was that it skewed more gay, more male, which is it's fine. There's nothing wrong with that at all. And I couldn't quite fully see myself in that space. He would sometimes invite, lesbian preachers, but overall the feeling was that, and it didn't often feel like it was fully for me. So I kind of just stepped away from the whole thing.
Yeah.
So now we're in Kenya.
Yeah.
It's boiling hot, Africa.
Yeah.
The streets are bustling.
Yeah.
Bustling streets,
Yeah.
People milling about, people selling. You've got the matatus, the buses with the graffiti, the beautiful graffiti along the sides of the buses. Every bus is a work of art.
Yeah. What I mean? And an African work of art,
African.
Very specific slogans.
Yes.
I mean, some of
them
the slogans.
are religious.
Yeah, they're religious. But there's some of the signage you get in Africa, whether it's like on taxis or, I always remember my hairdresser, which advertises proudly how it offers the corkscrew hairstyle, meant to be corkscrew.
Them ones are for real,
And I'm just like, is there another service that's silently done on the side here, or what's going on?
Nudge, nudge, wink, wink.
Okay, but yes, going back.
Yeah, so you got the matatus. Some of them have got 50 Cent on them.
Yeah,
graffitied. You got with God, all things are possible. And all of these wonderful things that these matatus are driving by. It's intense, it's noisy, And then you kind of go into what looks like you're trying to go into maybe an accountant. That's the doorway that you're going through. I think it's an accountant.
Yep.
And so suddenly there's a whole bunch of really queer people. And, you can tell queer people.
You can't always.
No, yeah, fair enough.
Fair enough.
I stand corrected.
When we get to my story, you'll know that you can't always tell queer people. Most people do not read me as queer.
That's very true. So I definitely stand corrected on that. But, you know, there are some.
Some of us are flamboyant.
Some are flamboyant.
Yeah.
Some of us are butch.
Yeah.
And we step onto the scene and you know that we're a bit different.
Beautifully different.
Beautifully different. And so suddenly you've got this beautiful group of people giving peak queer, and then we all just parade into this stairwell. And then we go up this dark stairwell, and then it opens out into a space that it looks like any of the spaces that I grew up in worshiping in, you know, because, you know, another aspect of the Nigerian community that I grew up in is we used whatever space we could find to worship.
Yes.
So very often you would find our churches on industrial estates.
Warehouses, right?
Yeah, industrial estates, on the top of shops, community centres. We didn't have purpose-built churches like the Catholics do, for example, in their cathedrals, or the Anglicans do in their churches. And so it was suddenly familiar to me. I was like, oh, okay, I get this. And then you can see the banquet chairs, you know, the ones with the gold metal, and then the
maroon reds or navy sometimes.
So they're all stacked in the corner, and instantly my 10-year-old church self is like, yeah, I know we're going to get those chairs and we're going to have to put them out. So I'm there to shoot a film, but suddenly I'm in church mode, like, do we need to get the chairs?
Yeah.
And the pastor's like, yep, we're going to put them out. So we get the chairs, we put them out. There's some white, you know, those white garden chairs, plastic chairs.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Yeah. We have them on my parents' farm.
Those ones. Yes.
Yeah, you know them from when you were there. Yeah.
And we put those out. Then the pulpit comes out, you know, see-through perspex with the logo of the church on it.
Yeah.
And then the keyboard player gets his keyboard out and he puts it on a table. And then, of course, he then has to stack 3 banquet chairs in order to be the right height to play the keyboard.
And can he reach the pedals?
Can he reach well, this one, I don't think it had any. He may have had a pedal, actually, a sustained pedal.
Oh, it really does my head in when you have the church keyboardist with no pedal. It's like, it's just like, you know.
We're not getting that smooth sustain.
Yeah, exactly.
And so the keyboard is in position. Somebody's cranking up the sound system. You've got a bit of feedback, you know, as they're trying to sort out the sound. And then, of course, you've got the uncle with the big voice. He's like, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2. 1, 2, 1, 2, 2, 2. And the thing's like, and then we're ready to go. And then the worship starts, the praise and worship. So that's the music portion of the show starts. And I'm hearing, the drummer in the corner as well, with a drum kit that's too loud for the space that we're in, but we love it loud, so let's go.
Yeah.
And he starts beating out an African rhythm.
Oh, yes.
The keyboard player starts playing the chords, and then I think it was a woman who was leading the worship starts singing, and suddenly I'm at home in a way that I'd never been at home before in queer-affirming church spaces.
Yeah.
I was like, this is familiar to me. I didn't know that you could have a Pentecostal, queer-affirming space.
Yeah.
And it blew my mind. I almost forgot to film. I was like, what?
That's what blew my mind when I saw, you know, your film and the trailer, because of course I knew objectively, of course you can be African, queer and Christian, but I had never seen it put in front of me unapologetically on the screen. And to this day, because I wasn't there, I still have never felt that.
Yeah.
And I just... I've never seen... I mean, how, outside of that experience, have you seen it?
No.
No, right?
No.
So do I know Africans who are Christians who are gay in the church back home in Botswana, where I come from? Sure. But they are assimilating into a mainstream church and sort of playing down their queerness. You know, they're not talking about it. It's not part of their worship, their practice, their liturgy, their theology, you know? So yeah, that was, it was so powerful to see. And what did you feel being in that space?
It felt affirming because I was surrounded by LGBTQ plus people expressing themselves fully in the presence of God.
Wow.
I'd never seen that before. Normally we hide when we're in the church.
Yeah.
You know, which is how those people in the comments about the gay imam who got shot in South Africa, that's the reason why those people in the comments can say things like, it's impossible for you to be gay and an imam.
Yeah.
Because generally speaking, what happens in the church is that, the non-affirming church, is that we're there, we're just hidden.
Yeah. The other side of it, the other narrative you hear in that space, which I've heard in other religious Christian faiths, for example, is that, okay, well, we know you're gay, but the problem is when you're now promoting it and advocating for it and saying it out loud. It's like, be gay very quietly and pray that God fixes you and makes you, I don't know, what, normal? Whatever normal is, like cis-het, right? Cisgendered, as in you feel like you're the gender you were assigned at birth, and heterosexual, you like the so-called opposite sex, you know? Okay, so you have this incredible experience in Nairobi. How did that make you reflect upon your life up until that point and how you related to your faith and your queerness?
I think after the service, when I went back to where we were staying, I felt an overwhelming feeling of sadness. And I feel it to some degree even now as I talk about it, because a part of me felt like I wished I'd had that community earlier. Do you know what I mean? Because in that space, you can see all of you. And I feel like if you can see all of you, you can then see your potential. And if you can see your potential, you can achieve your potential. Whereas for me, that was significantly delayed.
Yeah. What age would you have been at that point?
What, when I shot the film?
Yeah.
I was 36, 7? 6, 7?
Yeah. So it took till 36, 7 to have any experience of affirmation of these different parts of yourself.
Absolutely.
So what was it like prior to that point? How did you reconcile the fact that, I mean, you grew up in a Pentecostal fundamentalist church.
Yeah.
And at some point you come out, like, when did that happen? How did that happen?
So, you know, for those who may not know, the Pentecostal church, and I think Christianity more broadly, tends towards the homophobic, the rejection of sexuality, of non-normative, non-heterosexual sexuality. There are certain Bible verses that are used to support their beliefs. They tend to be mostly in the Old Testament. There are a couple of verses in the New Testament. These are the two halves of the Bible. And so I spent all my life hearing those Bible verses used to denigrate anybody who was homosexual. So the moment you have an understanding that you might be that, you're instantly at war with yourself internally, right? Because you can't be the thing that you are in that space, because that space is actively against the thing that you are. So you're at war with yourself.
Yeah. When did that war start for you? What age were you first aware? Like,
I was quite young. I was still in primary school and I had the first inklings, and it was when I had a crush on...
I know. Can I say the name?
Yes, you can.
I know you had a crush on a girl called Wumi.
Yeah, Wumi.
Where is she now? What if she listens?
I don't even know, but I just remember being head over heels in love. And I knew that I liked her more than just a friend, because I had female friends.
Yeah.
And I loved them as my female friends.
Yeah.
But this felt different.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know? And then it's like, well, this community that I was in frowned upon any relationship outside of marriage. So it wasn't just homosexual. It was like fornication is a sin.
Yeah.
And in order to not fornicate...
You must first marry.
You must first marry.
Yeah.
Or don't even think about the thing.
Yeah.
Don't even think. Whatever you have to do to not fornicate, you have to do. Purify your mind, your thoughts, everything. And then you won't even go into fornication. For those who don't know, fornication is the act of having sex outside of marriage. So already we're at war with our desires anyway.
Yeah. So this war with yourself.
Yeah, it was world war. It was a world war because it was all of me at war with myself.
What did it look like? And were you unable to reconcile being Christian and queer?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Even long after I left the church, I couldn't really reconcile it. And whilst Reverend Jide's teaching, so one of the teachings that he had this really beautiful acronym, which is GAY, which obviously spells gay, but he put each letter as G for God, A adore, and Y for you. So God adores you. And I remember, I have to say, you're saying now.
No, but it's making me feel emotional because there's so many people who need to hear that.
Yeah, but when you hear it, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be okay with it. Because the first time I saw that, there was a gut revulsion towards it. You know, I don't feel proud to say that, but at the time I was just like, that felt blasphemous.
But that's internalized homophobia,
Absolutely.
surely, because, you know, you had been told by everyone around you to believe that.
Absolutely.
So, of course, hearing that, it's not going to feel affirming.
No way. You know, you're taught that homosexuality and homosexuals are an abomination. It's against the natural order.
Yeah.
So you are not natural.
Yeah.
That's basically what the message is that you're getting, right?
Yeah.
When you are getting that message externally, it does sink deep into yourself. And then there's a type of self-hatred that happens because you're like, I hate the fact that I can't be natural. I hate the fact that I can't be normal. I hate the fact that all the things that my friends are aspiring to, which is heterosexual marriage, building a family, having kids, and so on and so forth, I can't.
They don't feel available
It doesn't feel available.
Yeah.
I could pretend.
Or possible, yeah.
But one of the things I always knew from young was I am not going to marry someone and end up in a miserable marriage for two reasons. Number one, I've seen miserable marriages. I've seen domestic violence. I've seen all kinds of abuses. I don't want to be in that situation. That's one reason for marriage, whether heterosexual or homosexual. And the second thing is I don't want to marry someone in a lie and make their life miserable and take away their chance at happiness and take away mine. It's better that I stay single.
Yeah.
So that was how I felt. Now, I know that can be different for other people. You know, we've heard of, you know, lavender marriages where a lesbian person marries a gay man and they form a partnership in order to
survive their families and their cultures.
Exactly.
Like absolute critique of them and live freely. Well, freely for them, right?
Yes, yeah.
It may involve secrecy, but they feel this is the best way to survive what they've been handed to deal with.
Absolutely.
Right?
And maybe perhaps if I was raised in, you know, a Nigerian context, maybe I would have just surrendered to that kind of marriage and got on with it. But at that point in my life, in the British context, I didn't want to do that. It was better for me to be single.
Yeah.
So.
No, I hear that. I mean, for the end of this segment, there's really one question I want to ask you. Why are you gay?
Why am I gay? Oh, Lord. Because God made me that way.
Hey! You know, I was laughing to myself because I kept hearing that Instagram reel with that guy. That's like, why are you gay?
Why are you gay?
Who says I'm gay?
You are gay.
Like, I chose this.
Just woke up. And that's another thing with that whole thing. It's like, would you choose a sexuality that alienates you from your faith, alienates you from your family, makes you a pariah? It's
I mean, who would choose that prison sentence?
You know, so any you know, LGBTQ plus person who, you know, steps outside of, you know, their community to say, I am queer, I am lesbian, I'm gay, I'm bisexual. I mean, that takes a lot of strength.
Yeah.
Obviously, I know some of your story, but I'm really interested in what your background is with faith and how that may have intersected with your sexuality.
So I was raised in Southern Africa, as you know, in Botswana. And first of all, I had a mixed faith background of sorts, which I've made sense of because I study religion as a researcher. And so you have to kind of say, like, how do you see the world based on how you were raised? And I had a white father, a Protestant, had grown up in this kind of high Anglican, bells and incense and lots of ceremony, but quite stiff ceremony, the kind of thing he encountered in the affirming churches over in the UK. He had come from that, but he was a geologist and a teacher. And so he had got to the point where he struggled to reconcile his belief system, his faith, with his understanding of how the world came to be. He couldn't reconcile Genesis or a literal interpretation of it with geology. And so he kind of lost his faith, but he wasn't anti-religious. He was just not religious, I would say. And then my mum, on the other hand, she grew up with this mixture of indigenous African beliefs, which then got pushed out because essentially she was educated in a missionary Catholic school. As a very young person, and then really took that on, and apparently was, like, from what she tells me, really active in, like, the Catholic girls' school movement.
Okay, Ma Walker.
She was just out there, just doing the work of God.
Oh, amen.
And whatever. But by the time I think we had come along as kids, whatever that fervor was had diminished somewhat. And so she had this kind of fleeting relationship with faith. She sort of believed, she struggled with elements of it, she struggled with the institutional aspect of it, but nonetheless, we would go to church, and I loved going to church. We went to Catholic church. It felt very different to the Catholic churches I've encountered in the West.
My abiding memory of going to that church was you'd walk in, maybe sometimes the service had started, and you'd walk quietly to your pew, make the sign of the cross, and then you would cram yourself into these jam-packed pews, and everyone was kind of calm and stayed, and then it would get to the songs, and it was just so, there was movement, there was swaying, there was singing, there was dancing, and it was just so African.
It really felt more about community than it did about religious fervor. Like, I don't remember what you described, like actively homophobic rhetoric at all. And then I also used to church hop with friends.
Church hop.
So church hop, what I mean by that is I had friends who were Methodist, I had friends who were Baptist. I loved something about churches or religious communities or people gathering, especially when there was singing involved. I loved it from young. So any excuse, especially because my mum was away a lot and my dad wasn't religious, I would try and go to a friend's church. And I loved seeing these different ways people worshipped. I found it fascinating, right? And like baptisms where people get fully dunked. It's like so different to the Catholic church where it was like, anyway, I loved it.
I loved baptisms because I just loved seeing the most composed people dunked in the water. And you see them, because, a lot of, unfortunately, a lot of us black people, we don't really swim. So that dunking is quite terrifying. So you just see these aunties that...
They do probably feel they've been saved in that
moment.
No,
they have. They've been really saved on 2 accounts.
Yeah, exactly. So that's entertaining, if nothing else. And I love that. So the other thing about me is I didn't have the womby moment, I would call it, that you had, where there was this girl in your church and you knew it was something different you were in love and... blah, 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 and how are you going to reconcile this? I did not have that. There's no doubt about it. I was always attracted to boys from a young age. And I think probably one of my first memories of realizing, hey, was there were these twins, Daniel and Emma, who were expat kids who had come to live in Botswana. And I went round for a play date at their place.
As you do
when you're young. And I remembered we were going to play Kiss Catch. And...
Is that what you guys called it in Botswana?
Kiss Catch. Hey, Kiss Catch. You don't know Kiss Catch.
I don't know Kiss Catch. I know Kiss Chase.
Oh, maybe it was called Kiss Chase. I don't know. All I know is you're meant to catch the person, and I was up for that. You have to catch before you can kiss.
Oh, I love it. I love it.
So it was, what do you call it? Kiss Catch?
Well, I remember it as Kiss Chase.
Okay, maybe it's Kiss Chase. Right.
But I kind of like Kiss Catch. There's something...
Listen, there's no fun if there's no catching. That's all I know.
That's very true.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I remember that I was on, which meant that everyone else was running and I had to catch someone. and it was only Daniel and Emma playing. And I was like, as I was being told you're on, I was thinking, I don't know if Emma should play. But then the worst thing was that when it was like, okay, go, and you had to run, I was like, who do I go for?
Not you frozen in bisexual
Emma?
indecision.
I was frozen in bisexual indecision. I was like, do I want Emma or do I want Daniel? And I was like, I think I made a really quick calculation that the social repercussions for pursuing Emma were high.
So you went for?
So I was like, I'll go for Daniel. That seems like the safe bet. Although I did actually think I preferred Emma.
Oh, you did?
Yeah. I mean, I was stuck in, what did you call it?
Bisexual indecision.
That was. I mean, I know that gets
A or B, or A or B, and 1 and 2 and 1 and 2.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, there's lots of awful stereotypes about bisexual people, like that we are indecisive or whatever. But I will say,
sorry, my bisexual siblings. I'm sorry,
but it was true in that moment. It really was. It was like a bit of a head fuck. Can I say that on you?
Of course.
Yeah. So there was that, and as if I look back today as an adult, now I'm out. There were many moments like that in my childhood. I don't know how I managed to magically forget them, unsee them, whatever. But there were many moments like that. I do think one thing that disrupted me being more aware of my sexuality was that I left home at a very young age, at 11.
Okay.
And for all sorts of reasons, that leaving home was quite traumatic. And so I don't think I had the bandwidth in my life to think about sexually who I was in the way that I might have if I'd just stayed in Botswana. I don't know. I wondered that before. But I think more in terms of this faith and sexuality thing, it was weird because I got very mixed messages. So I grew up on a school campus. My dad was a teacher, and it was quite a progressive school. It was a school that had been set up to stand against our neighbouring country, South Africa, and its apartheid state. It was meant to be a multicultural school, and it had all sorts of like afternoon activities and programs like Amnesty International. So some of my early memories were like walking through like this kind of passageway in the school near a water fountain where all the kids drank, and there'd be like an Amnesty International stand, and there'd be these like pamphlets in those days printed on paper where people were campaigning for the release of people who'd been locked up in prisons in context simply for being gay. And I do remember very young having this absolutely visceral sense that this was wrong. So although no adult ever talked with me about that, I read those leaflets and I felt compelled to write a letter and just say, this is wrong. I didn't relate that to my own identity, but I just had this sense, this is not okay. And although I don't remember like overt homophobia, there was definitely homophobia in the culture everywhere. I mean, I did know that same-sex acts were criminalized in Botswana. There were whisperings around certain people, teachers on the campus, who were definitely part of the LGBTQ plus family. And I guess at some level I knew it was a taboo, but it wasn't rammed down my throat, this is a sin, where I was. That would not be the same for many of my Botswana counterparts or even Muslim friends at school growing up back there, because it was very multicultural. But for me, I didn't get that kind of conflict that you had.
It's so interesting because you fast forward to now and, Botswana is actually quite LGBTQ plus. I guess the law has been decriminalized.
Yeah, we still don't have same-sex marriage.
Don't have same-sex marriage, but in Nigeria, you could be thrown in prison for, I think they've upped it even to, I think, is it 14 years in prison or thereabouts? I need to double check. But you can go to prison in Nigeria for, engaging in homosexual sexual activities.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, relative to a lot of African nations, Botswana has been progressive, but socially there's still so far to go.
That's always the case though, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It is.
Hearts and minds tend to change slower than laws, unfortunately.
Yeah, definitely. And I think in a way, I wonder who I would have been if I'd faced the same actively virulent homophobia that you did, because there's something about my reaction to an amnesty pamphlet that was so defiant, that mirrors my defiance when I see overt racism or racism of any kind that I had a language for.
Yeah.
But in a way, I think it took me, in some ways, a lot longer to come out and unpack, because I clearly knew I shouldn't come out. Just because I didn't receive violent homophobic messaging didn't mean I didn't struggle.
Yeah.
So even to this day, I wonder, like, those subtle ways it's in the culture, what that does to you.
It definitely does something.
Yeah.
It does something psychically, because messages aren't just received verbally. That's the reason why in branding, messages are translated beyond the words. They're translated with imagery.
Yeah, and ident.
To your subconscious.
Yeah.
There's a reason why the golden arches with McDonald's are part of the culture beyond the borders of the country that it comes from, where you see the golden arches and you think America. Yeah. You think fast food, but fast food that feels somehow better than other fast food, or like
a superior brand.
do you know what I mean? And that's transmitted subconsciously.
Yeah.
So I think there is a subconscious programming that happens that we're not always aware of until we are face to face with something.
Yeah.
So in my case, it was like, how can he say God adores you and that's gay? God, it was just like, what?
Yeah.
Because my unconscious programming was like, that's not right.
Yeah. And it's in those moments, those tiny moments where you realize it's there. Like, for example, that situation when I was playing Kiss Catch, I still knew there were social costs to following the woman.
Yeah,
or that
absolutely.
wasn't the done thing. It wasn't
That's
the
the
script I'd
subconscious.
seen.
Yeah.
At the very least, I hadn't got a model for that made that acceptable.
Exactly.
I didn't think of that as vibe. I was like, am I allowed to? Am I not? Like, I went through so many layers, and then I just went through the safe script, the safe route.
Yes.
I guess for many years, there was, for me, a lot of passing privilege that came by being in relationships with men. But, I think it's, often we talk about passing privilege. You look like a cisgendered heterosexual person. And so, you're not standing up enough for, the LGBT community. But there's also an invisibility. Yeah. It's like you're living this life where a good portion of you is not seen. And people make all these assumptions about you.
Absolutely.
So, it's an interesting one. We had very different experiences, I think.
Yeah, very, very different experiences. And yet here we are together.
We are.
In holy matrimony, dare I say it.
Who knew?
Oh, darling.
Who knew?
Is that an abomination?
It will be for some.
So at the top of this episode, it started with a deep dive into my work, Kenyan Christian Queer, which is looking at the intersections between faith, sexuality and Africanness. How has faith and sexuality shown up in the work that you do?
I mean, I would say it showed up in my professional life before I was out to myself. I would say maybe 10 years into my career. So I worked for an organisation which at the time was called the Three Faiths Forum, and it's now called the Faith and Belief Forum. And it was an organisation that did what we call interfaith work, so work to build bridges between different faith communities, but also to hold like critical dialogues within faith communities about issues. So it could be what are people's views on gender, like the role of women in that faith. It could be about looking at LGBT people within that particular faith group. It was about really having dialogue around these kind of important issues. And one of the things that hit me straight into going into that organisation, we had 2 Jewish directors, and one of them, the deputy director, was openly gay and in a relationship with a woman and went on to have a child with that woman. And it was the first time I think I had encountered something like you described with going to Nairobi and seeing this, LGBT affirming church. In that I had never seen these things actively brought together. Here's someone who's Jewish, in fact came from quite an Orthodox background originally, and had found ways to still build family and saw that these things should be reconcilable. And we had a program in that organisation that really explicitly brought together people of faith who were also LGBT for these dialogues to educate people broadly that you can reconcile these things. Just because you're religious doesn't mean you cannot be inclusive. There are different theologies and ways people are working these things out. And it's possible to be both things. So I don't see myself as in a faith community, but it did have a really profound effect on me. And I think it probably became quite instrumental in me being able to then eventually make sense of my own sexuality.
Okay. So again, it's kind of similar in the sense that you see it, so then you can be it.
Yeah.
Or at least stand in a greater confidence.
Yep.
Within your sexuality.
Yeah.
With your sexuality.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it's so interesting.
And for me at that stage, I would say the one thing about that is I almost became, I wouldn't quite say dogmatically, but frustrated by people who wanted to point out that religion and queerness cannot coexist, and that if I'm gay, I have to leave the church. Like, for example, your response when we met was sometimes came across to me, and we had to do a lot of working through this as almost anti-religious. But also not. It would flip between two things. And I found that so difficult because in a way I'd been brought into a cult of religion can be inclusive and just, look how great religion can be. And of course, there are many instances of that and you've got to talk about that. But there are also times when religion and theology is used violently and oppressively. So, religion is a complex phenomenon. It was one of the reasons I love studying it. And I was drawn to sociology of religion.
I think you are right, obviously, because we were going through it together towards the beginning of our relationship. I think there's a militancy to the particular sect of Christianity that I was raised in. And what I often find is that you just swap one militancy for another militancy. So where that one was violently and virulently anti-LGBTQ+,
that one meaning the church you have been part of.
And just the broader Pentecostal faith, because I was in multiple churches in my life. All I did was I took that kind of violent anti-LGBTQ+ and traded it for, when I came out of the church, into a kind of violent anti-religion, anti-Christianity,
And was it also heavily pro-LGBT? Do you see what I mean?
No, that's the weird thing. I wouldn't say it was pro. I would say I was still a bit uncomfortable. I just didn't know, it's going to sound weird, but how to be this new thing that my whole life had taught me was very, very bad and an abomination.
Yeah.
You don't just, come out of it and then you're just swimming in boobs and ass. You kind of come out, you're really trying to find your feet. But what I did know is that I was now in a place where all of the pain and the frustration made me so angry. It was like, you are the cause of that.
Yeah.
And I don't believe that anything that I am right now can be reconciled with all that I was. And so I'm anti that.
Yeah.
And it's taken me a lot of time, swinging, to bridge that gap.
Yeah, and I don't think that sounds weird at all. I mean, the thing was painful and violent towards you specifically. So,
and to some degree, still is.
100%. And that's the piece I wanted to get to because, I kind of, through our journey, came to realize that it was violent of me to always point out the ways that religion is not always homophobic to someone who had been through what you had been through. Because when you've been through that, what you need is validation and affirmation of a truth.
Absolutely.
And, I think probably the moments where I started to come closer to your position and your utter resistance was in the run-up to us getting married, because suddenly...
Yes.
I entered your world in a different way.
Yeah, you were baptized by fire.
I was baptized by fire and by force.
Yeah.
And, are you comfortable talking about that?
Yeah. I mean, the bottom line is my family are still very much a part of that faith, that sect of Christianity. And we invited them to the wedding. For me,
Our last minute wedding, we should add.
Oh, yeah, that was our last minute wedding. We invited them. It was almost like, look, you never know. They may come. They may show that they love me and still turn up, even if they don't agree with,
Yeah.
And also, I don't want there to be an excuse in 10 years' time where they say, well, you didn't invite us. And then that's their convenient excuse. You were invited, And of course, the responses came back, I can't in good conscience go to your wedding. I don't believe in it. I stand against it, all of this stuff.
But they'll support us in any other way.
Sort of, yeah. Because, and then a heart emoji, because love. Anyway, let's probably not get too deep into that. But the bottom line is that it was very clear to you in that moment, you got a taste of that violence.
I think it was weirdly less the violence that felt directed at me, but more watching it, what it did to you. Because I remember being in this conflict with you and you were like, I don't need to invite them. There's no point. And me thinking to myself, toying, maybe even speaking to a couple of friends, should I just encourage her? I think this is a self-protection mechanism from her. What if they want to come? Should I just encourage her to invite them? Because then at least we know and they can't throw it back in her face. Mm-hmm. And you were naturally and rightly self-protective and probably weren't going to invite them or invite them like one day before so that you couldn't be disappointed and maybe couldn't face the reality that they would be that violent again. Yes. Right?
Yeah.
And I'm going to be honest, I sort of thought, are you okay?
Yeah. No, it's just funny. It's just,
it's
just one of those things,
Yeah. I sort of thought that they would, I'll tell you why I thought there was a chance that they might come or at least try to support is that I had some brilliant conversations with your mum specifically, who obviously I'm so grateful that she brought you into the world and, not only did I have nice conversations, my mum and her started talking when we went to Southern Africa last year. And I thought, maybe something is shifting.
Yeah.
I was pulled in, I'll tell you now.
Yeah.
And so I thought, I think we should at least invite them, then at least we know. And I'll be honest, I was naive. And I felt bad for that. And I felt bad for putting you in a position where you asked. But also, in some way, the reality and the you couldn't run away from the response.
Oh, no.
And so it also made things clearer for us.
Absolutely.
And it gave us a truth that was impossible and painful for you. But Absolutely. I was like, I think the what brought me closer to your position was less that it hurt me and more that I felt deeply self-protective of you, even though I had led you to this thing. It pushed me into a different place with it.
Yeah.
That and realizing that you ideally would have had a church wedding. And then there was no way that was even really possible. We have friends who could have done blessings.
Don't even get me started on that. Yeah. Because in my vision of my life, I get married in a church. But, I think even the laws of the land outside of Pentecostalism don't allow it.
Nope.
So
you can get a blessing.
But you can't have like a church marriage. And the bottom line is that's my background and I still felt that was important, even though I wasn't a practicing Christian and I don't go to church and all of that stuff. Somehow that still felt important to me. So it was sad on two fronts, that my family wouldn't be there and I wouldn't be able to get married in a church.
Yeah. And that's because religion is much about culture, what you've seen, what you do, how you commemorate and mark special things, how you belong to your community. Yep. And, you've watched that happen around with your peers.
Absolutely.
You've watched that happen with family members.
Yeah.
And then you're basically being told that's denied you because of something fundamental to who you are.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the most painful thing was the year before, we as a family had gone to a family friend's wedding. I watched my family celebrate with the fullness of their being, throw their hands up in worship, bless the couple, with prayers, thank God for their lives. In the reception afterwards, I watched them dance. We all danced together, to the Afrobeats tunes, ate food, cheered, threw the confetti, you know what I mean? Just danced together with the couple and just really ushered them into their marriage, right?
Yeah.
Only to know a year later that what had been offered to this family friend, my family would never offer that to me. They won't dance for me. They won't throw the confetti. They won't pray for me. They won't thank God for my life and for my marriage and usher me into this new chapter of my life. They would not extend that deep, beautiful blessing and love that a family should. And I think that was the hardest thing because it was only a year apart.
Yeah. I feel you. The thing that I guess would love to know is how you make sense of the same thing today, because this marriage experience is very recent for us. So do you feel like you found a way to reconcile faith, sexuality, Africanness, or?
I think that I'm still on that journey, but I do feel like I'm closer to the destination in the sense that I've had some brilliant guides along the way. As I mentioned, Reverend Jide at House of Rainbow, seeing the community in Kenya, who I'm infinitely thankful for their existence. Bishop Tolton, who appears in the film as well. I remember I just cried when I finished interviewing him in New York for the film. And I cry when I saw Reverend Jide at UK Black Pride. So we were doing a podcast for UK Black Pride, and I got Reverend Jide we had an audio van, and I got him in the van, and I was talking to him, and I broke down again. These are really important men in my life, because you've got to understand the churches I grew up in were always headed by powerful African men who led the congregation with conviction and fervor and almost like quite pastoral, in the way they led their congregations. And in a way, Bishop Tolton and Reverend Jide are similar, but queer.
Yeah.
They are beautiful, strong African men who lead their inclusive communities in faith, in love, towards a higher ideal, right?
Yeah.
And so in that space, it just felt like, again, another piece of home, but in a slightly different context. And so I feel like the building blocks of my reconciliation are being layered on top of each other, but the house isn't built.
Wow, that was poetic. That was so well put.
Do you see what I mean? It's a journey, and I'm going to continue to build that house. I don't think it has a roof on it yet, but we're getting there.
We're building it together, brick by brick.
That's it,
We are.
It is.
You build it into being.
Absolutely.
A thing that you've never seen.
Absolutely.
Because you talked about these powerful men, but where are the powerful women?
Exactly. Hey, you talk about women, but actually in the film, The Kenny Christian Queer, there was an incredible woman by the name of Prophetess Jacinta. And she is, and was, a lesbian Christian and prophetess, as her title suggests. And every Sunday, she would go out on the colourful matatus that I mentioned and preach to the passengers on the bus. And the bus drivers would let her do that. I found her woman priestliness, her the prophetess in her, reminded me so much of my mum, because my mum was a church leader. My mum is a church leader. And she pretty much for most of my early years ran the women's fellowship out of our living room in Greenwich, in Southeast London. And she was a leader of women in the church. And in addition to that, she would also preach on the streets.
Yeah.
She called it her evangelism, right? And she had no problem going up to anyone. It didn't matter to her whether you were homeless. It didn't matter whether you were a drug addict, whether you were a businessman coming from work. It didn't matter. She was going to preach to you and tell you that Jesus loves you. And so when I saw Prophetess Jacinta, I almost saw my mum, a powerful woman leading. But I think the thing that made me slightly uncomfortable was that I felt a resistance, and I could be wrong, but I felt a slight resistance from the church congregation towards her and her inclusion in the film, if I'm being honest, and also within the church itself.
Yeah.
It felt like she wanted to do more, and she wanted to speak, maybe preach and so on, but it felt like there was maybe a resistance to that.
Yeah.
I could be speaking out of turn. It's just what I felt.
Yeah.
In that, and I have to say that. And I really wish I'd spent more time with her, because what I wanted to do was go to her home and find out a bit more about her and her life, because she'd been married to a man for a long period of time. There was so much to her story that I didn't get to dive into as deeply because I had to film other people. Unfortunately, a lot of those people let me down.
Yeah.
They didn't turn up, they would cancel at the last minute. And I remember thinking to myself, I could have spent days with this woman and done a really deep dive into her story and who she is and what makes her who she is, this lesbian prophetess, right?
Yeah.
So in answer to your question, there are women that have been really important in my understanding of myself. But yeah, that's where I'm at.
Yeah. Well, here's to more women that help people who are struggling with this issue,
Yes.
reconcile it,
Yeah.
and live in the ways that you always advocate for, with peace and freedom.
Peace and freedom.
Yeah.
If you have any questions for us, please reach out at rigourandflow@gmail.com. That's RIGOUR, because we're in the UK, and AND, flow, FLOW. And ask us questions. Is there some things about this episode that resonated with you, or that you don't agree with, or you want to give feedback on? Honestly, reach out. We're open. We're always looking to grow and improve. So definitely get in touch. And if you have a question, definitely, because we'll be answering these questions in subsequent episodes. So definitely let us know. All the organizations we've spoken about, the people we've spoken about, we will link to in the show notes if you're listening on the audio platforms, or on the description, or in the description in our YouTube page.
Sounds good.
In the description of the show.
That part.